Folks, what I have in front of me is the new Dell Inspiron 16 Plus. Now, I know that it's another Dell laptop since the previous Inspiron 14 2-in-1 that I looked at had its own set of issues, but this one's different because it comes in a 16-inch form factor, which is actually starting to get more popular these days, and it's got some pretty good specs, including RTX graphics, a 16:10 high-resolution display in an all clean and simple design. The focus for this laptop is to deliver the best value in the $1,000 to $1,500 price range. Now, there are a lot of good things to like about this laptop, since I've been using it for a few weeks, and I would actually go on record and say that it's a great option for students and for people who are looking for a happy medium between basic and premium. So let's dive in, talk about the good and bad right after this.
The NZXT capsule microphone. Get the best airflow for your vocal experience with a modular pop-out chamber to simplify installation on and off the bass. Control the gain for best volume RPM in a package that looks this good with USB-C and headphone input I/O with a true unbox, plug-and-play solution for your loud thoughts to shine. The capsule sounds pretty neutral as you can hear, plus it's a good place to start if you plan to overclock with EQ later. Check out the NZXT capsule black or white down below.
Okay, so let's kick things off with the price. The base model starts at $850, and for that, you get 11th Gen Core i5 11400H with 6 cores and 12 threads, 8 GB of RAM, 256 GB of storage, and integrated graphics. The next tier gets a huge bump in price to $1,425, and that comes with a Core i7 CPU with 4 extra threads, twice the memory and storage, and an RTX 3050 discrete GPU. Oddly, they do offer an RTX 3060 with a 1TB SSD for about the same price. I'm not even kidding. I mean, you can check this out right over here. Now, that situation could change where the 3050 model can get a huge discount compared to the 3060 model. So just keep an eye out for that. I also want to mention that I do have the 3050 sample just because we haven't tested a laptop with the GPU, so it'll be interesting to see how it compares to its bigger brothers. The other thing I want to mention is that you can only get this GPU with a Core i7 processor, so you can't do a Core i5 and a 3050 or 3060. It would have been cool, but you just don't get it. Now, you might be asking yourselves, where does this laptop stack up against the competition? Well, first off, right off the top of my head, there is the Legion Slim 7 that comes with a Ryzen CPU and an RTX 3060, but it's pricier than the Inspiron. Asus does offer ZenBooks with MX series and GTX 1650 Ti's, but that's really not worth it. Then you've got Acer's Helios 300, which is priced around the same, but it's too bulky and a bit on the aggressive side. I mean, I tried to look everywhere else, but I just couldn't find anything that would compete with something like the Inspiron 16 Plus. Maybe you could help me out in the comments, but I do want to mention that this is by no means a gaming laptop because it's just really trying to give you that medium mid-tier performance, if that makes any sense. Anyways, let's talk about the physical aesthetics of this guy. And right away, you can tell it looks clean and simple. You get the classic Dell logo up front, and I'm really digging this mist blue finish, and the exterior shell is made out of aluminum. It feels robust and sturdy, and that's something that I didn't expect in this price range. You also don't have to worry about fingerprints when handling this machine from a regular basis, and it's just easier to maintain. I love that part. The hinge is also super smooth to open, and you can do so with one hand. It's a little bit wobbly, but nothing to get worried about. I'm also really impressed with the size of this laptop. Now, yes, it's 16 inches, which might be too big for some people out there, but the Z height is only 0.75 inches or 19 millimeters. That's right in line with something like the Slim 7 from Legion, and it only weighs around 4.43 pounds. So you shouldn't have any issues carrying this to school or to work. The power cable is long enough, and the 130-watt adapter is noticeably smaller than what you get with the Slim 7 from Lenovo. So that's a pro to add to the bucket. Also, this laptop has Express Charge Boost, which is their fast charge technology, and that basically juices up the battery from 0 to 35% in about 20 minutes, which is pretty cool. When you open the lid, you're greeted with a full-size keyboard and a really large trackpad that I'll get to in a bit. The keys themselves are good. The travel distance is pretty shallow, so you'll miss out on some feedback when you bottom out. But hey, they had to do this in order to maintain that slim form factor, and it gets a job done. And it's also spill resistant, which is a good bonus. Unfortunately, the LED backlight output on this thing is very low. And on my sample, I noticed some inconsistencies with the lighting. You'll experience some level of discomfort when you're trying to distinguish the keys at night, unless if you're a pro typist. Switching gears to the trackpad, it's a larger surface area and it's not made entirely of glass. It's plastic, but the surface itself is very closer to glass, which makes navigation really smooth, including gesture-based inputs. Now, the primary left and right buttons are tactile, but I have run into a lot of instances where they do get stuck. So I have to wait a few minutes for it to sort of unpop to make it fully function, which does get a lot annoying, especially when you're trying to drag windows. So if you're looking for precise movement, this isn't the way to go. But for casual use, it gets the job done. Moving on to the I/O, on the left-hand side, you get power in, HDMI 2.0, USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A port, and a Thunderbolt 4 port with DisplayPort pass-through and power delivery. Switching over to the right, you get audio jack, another USB Type A port, and a full-size SD card reader, which I'm actually really surprised to see on a non-creator focused laptop. Get it? Creator focused. A lot of brands try to sell those without an SD card reader, but this does. Now, this is a great inclusion, but the performance is actually very poor. It can't even keep up with my faster UHS 1 cards, and the max throughput that I got was 20 megabytes per second. So that's just not going to cut it if you're trying to move larger video files to this machine. This is the webcam test on the Inspiron 16 Plus. Now, the quality is not that great, but one of the things that I did notice from my regular testing was that the color balance, or the white balance, shifts between warmer tones and cooler tones every now and then. But not right now. I'm in a controlled environment, so it's probably going to show you the right colors. But if you're in extreme low light environments, that's just a recipe for disaster. With the microphone quality, you can actually notice there's a lot of compression to my vocals, so it does sound overly processed. It's nowhere closer to ASUS's AI enhancements with their laptops, but this is just, it's passable. They've also included a physical switch right above the camera sensor, which blocks that, as you can see. So yeah, this is what it looks like. The speakers on this thing are actually pretty good. Now, don't confuse the front grille right above the keyboard with drivers. This is just an aesthetic touch, but the real ones are located at the bottom. And while generally these placements sound muffled, I had the opposite experience. The trebles actually were clear and there was a little bit of bass. I mean, nothing mind-blowing, but for this setup, it actually exceeded my expectations. So good job, Dell. Now, let's talk about that 16 by 10 display. It has a resolution of 3072 by 1920 at 60 Hz, which is an odd spec compared to Quad HD Plus or 2560 by 1600. But either way, you get a lot of vertical screen real estate to expand your content. And if you know me, I'm a sucker for these types of displays since it complements my productivity. On top of that, the color gamut is really impressive as it covers 100% sRGB, 81% Adobe RGB, and 83% DCI-P3. That to me is flat out impressive considering the price of this thing. So whether if you're on Netflix or editing photos or maybe a little bit of video, you're actually in for a treat. The viewing angles are great, you get thinner bezels, which gives it a modern aesthetic, and I didn't notice any backlit bleed on my sample, which is awesome. However, there is a downside to this panel because it actually doesn't get bright enough to comfortably view outdoors because max it goes is only as far as 274 nits, which in my opinion is below average. So keep that in mind before pulling the trigger. Now, this isn't a gaming laptop by any stretch of imagination, but if you were to game on it, 60 Hz is a significant trade-off, and you're actually much better off with something like the Slim 7 from Legion with a high refresh rate display. If you're looking to upgrade the 16 Plus, the options are flexible. As you can see, you get instant access to 2 RAM slots, which are already populated on my sample. Maximum supported memory is 32 gigabytes. The primary NVMe SSD is right over here, and the drive speeds are okay. I mean, the write performance is slower than some of the other laptops that I've tested here. Then again, this is a Kingston OM3 2230 SSD. Interestingly, there is another M.2 slot for storage expansion, but it only accepts another 2230 form factor. So my recommendation is maybe a few years down the road, you can swap that drive out for something a little bit more faster and use the existing 2230 drive and pop that into the secondary slot so you have storage for life. Now, what about battery life? Considering the Inspiron 16 Plus has one of the biggest battery of any Intel-based laptop I've seen recently, I had some pretty big expectations. And it actually did pretty good. I mean, look, this isn't at the same level as AMD's Ryzen 5000 series, since those CPUs can go into an ultra-low voltage mode when being used for lighter tasks like web browsing. But almost 11 hours is still respectable when you consider the Inspiron 16 also has one of the biggest screens here. Putting it under heavier load also ends up almost at the top of the chart, and that's probably because Dell's running the 11800H at a lower wattage mode, but more on that later. Either way, these numbers show what Dell's intent is for the laptop. It's sort of a hybrid device that's supposed to be good at pretty much everything, and it isn't targeted at just one narrow market. So even though the Inspiron 16 Plus isn't considered a gaming laptop, Dell has actually equipped it with the same software features. For example, under Dell Power Manager, they've actually expanded to have a bunch more options under thermal management. So now there are 4 options. Optimized, that's supposed to dynamically balance power, along with settings like cool, quiet, and ultra performance. But how does this thing react when they're used? Let's check it out. Starting with power, and right away, it's important to remind everyone that the 11800H in the Inspiron 16 Plus is technically rated to run between 35 watts and 45 watts. In the quiet setting, it starts off with a short burst to around 57 watts. Then its readout almost looks like a wave as it modulates between 38 watts and 45 watts to try and keep fan noise as low as possible. Meanwhile, when it comes to power, optimized and cool are basically the same setting, with both running at exactly 45 watts right through the test after that short burst of power at the beginning. I was sort of hoping that the so-called ultra performance mode would do things a bit differently, but that actually didn't really happen. I mean, sure, it hit a higher wattage of 62 watts to 65 watts twice for shorter bursts, and then it ended up settling right back to the same 45 watts. So obviously, Dell locked the chip to Intel's recommended upper TDP and left it at that. The frequencies for all the modes follow the exact same course as the power curves. They all have a quick burst of speed, and ultra performance has the second spike for a few seconds, while quiet pulses up and down for a bit. But otherwise, the maximum seems to be about 3 GHz. I mean, look, for shorter workloads, you'll see some differences between ultra performance and the others, but seriously, every one of these except quiet will give you pretty much identical results. Temperatures aren't really interesting either. Ultra performance is allowed to hit 100 degrees on 2 occasions, which is Intel's rated maximum, but that's quickly cut down to a lot more manageable 83 degrees over the long run. And yes, quiet runs pretty cool, but seriously, every mode here levels up between 77 and 83 degrees, so there's absolutely nothing to worry about. But remember, this is a pretty thin laptop, and something's gotta give in, and there's a bit of sacrifice on exterior temperatures. While the primary typing zones are pretty cool to the touch, the keyboard's center zones gets pretty toasty while the laptop's under heavier load. Luckily, in everyday tasks, there's no issues at all. There's also a bit of hot air blowing out over your mouse hand, but it's nothing like the jet exhaust feeling some gaming laptops blast you with. Looking at the underside, well, let's just say don't put this thing on your lap while it's chugging through something intensive. As for noise levels, both optimized and cool performed about the same, which does reflect a story that we've been seeing with the overtime graphs. Ultra performance gets a tad louder, but it's not that significant compared to the other two. Quiet, on the other hand, was, well, quiet. But hey, at least they don't sound like a jet fan. Now, before we go through the performance results, I need to put things into context. While the Intel Core i7 11800H is an 8-core 16-thread processor, like I said before, it just runs at 45 watts. So let's compare that to some of the other laptops that you'll be seeing. With all of them in their performance mode, the AMD-based laptops here typically run at higher wattages than the Trident 300 SC or even the Inspiron 16 Plus. The only exception is the Blade 14 that tops out at around 50 watts, but then there are laptops like the Legion Slim 7. Meanwhile, the 16 Plus is a bit more focused on hitting a lower budget, and it uses a less extreme heatsink than some others. So they need to compensate by capping the power of the 11800H at lower levels. So let's see what that does to performance when the Inspiron 16 is used in optimized mode. The Cinebench scores here are pretty competitive, but you also have to remember, these types of short tests play to Intel's chip's strengths of short performance bursts for a few seconds. The single thread scores are right in line with every other laptop here too, but that isn't a surprise either. But what happens when we're using actual applications? Well, from a performance per watt standpoint, the Inspiron does well, but it does tend to lose out to AMD-based laptops. That wouldn't normally be an issue, but you've got to remember, The Legion Sim 7 costs just $50 more, and it also comes with an RTX 3060 instead of the Inspiron 16's RTX 3050. Now, that might not normally sound like a big deal, but check out what happens in some creator-focused GPU-accelerated programs. In Premiere, it's right in the middle of things, since Intel's QuickSync video engine helps push things along, but laptops with faster GPUs do start pulling ahead. But in something that puts even more emphasis on graphics horsepower, the Inspiron 16 only ties the quad-core Trident 300 SE and loses to every other option. You would need to grab the 3060 option for better scores, but that pushes up the cost even more. And speaking of the RTX 3050, let's dive into how Dell has it set up. And honestly, there isn't really much of a difference here either, at least between the optimized and ultra performance modes. Both run at a constant 60 watts, which is closer to the upper end of NVIDIA's 35 to 80 watt rating for this particular GPU. But moving to cool and quiet, well, they cut things down by a lot, guys, all the way down to just 30 watts. So if you're interested in any gaming at all, avoid these two modes. And even though Dell's limiting power is below the RTX 3050's maximum TDP, frequencies hover right at the top of NVIDIA's boost spec in performance and optimized. Meanwhile, the other two modes go below 1200 MHz, which actually isn't too bad considering the limited amount of power being used here. It's almost like the 3050 loves lower voltage situations, and the performance impact isn't as much as you'd expect. Either way, temperatures in every mode are well managed while gaming, with even the highest performance settings kept at just about 75 degrees. This actually makes me wonder if Dell could have pushed it just a bit more power into the 3050 so it may be able to hit higher frequencies. I mean, it's obvious the cooling system's more than good enough. Now, before I move on to the gaming results, I do need to level with you guys about how I approach these. You see, the issue here is the Inspiron 16's odd 3K resolution of 3072 by 1920. It's the only laptop we've tested with it. So for comparison's sake, I'm just going to stick to 1080p testing here just to get an idea or broader idea on how things line up. And when it comes to frame rates, well, the combination of the 11800H and the RTX 3050 gives some pretty surprising results. The thing you need to remember here is that gaming performance on most laptops is usually CPU limited. That means the Inspiron 16 Plus ends up closer to the bottom of these charts, but it still ends up beating the Trident 300 SE, and that laptop's rocking an RTX 3060. The problem is that it's also using a much lower-end Tiger Lake H35 chip that just kills off the GPU's potential. So overall, the 3050 might be pretty slow, but it actually did a lot better than I ever expected. It isn't fast, especially given the Inspiron's price, since similarly priced laptops can get you a better gaming experience, and there is another problem too. Some games like Doom simply won't run on the RTX 3050 with our usual test settings because of its 4GB of VRAM. Now, given the way the gaming market's going, NVIDIA giving it just 4GB is just ridiculous. Alright, so I think it's time to wrap up my thoughts on the Inspiron 16 from Dell. And guys, I have to be really honest with you. I'm really impressed with what this brings to the table. You see, from the outside, it offers a sleek and minimal package, and the build quality is amazing. And when you open the lid, you're greeted with a beautiful display with wonderful color reproduction. The keyboard and trackpad, they get the job done except for the middle clicks that get stuck once in a while. The speakers sound pretty good, and the battery life is also impressive for this package. Now sure, if we flip the chapter over to performance, the CPU is trying really hard to keep up with Ryzen, while the GPU is also struggling its way to keep up with the big boys. But I mean, for 60 watts, it's not bad. I mean, the only thing to watch out for is the brightness levels of the display and the keyboard lighting output because they're both very low. And if you can wrap your head around those, and if you're shopping for a value-oriented Windows laptop between $1,000 and $1,500, this is it, guys, the Inspiron 16 Plus. So on that note, thank you so much for watching. I hope you were able to take away everything that you needed to know about this little guy. Not little guy, but big guy. Let me know what you guys think. I'm Ebor with Hardware Canucks. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one.